Few actors in history have mastered the art of transformation quite like Sir Anthony Hopkins. For over 6 decades, he has moved between monsters and men, saints and sinners. Each role is performed with such quiet precision that audiences forget they are watching an actor at all. Now at 88 years old, Hopkins remains a living study in discipline and humility, in the eternal curiosity that keeps the great artists alive. Ask him to talk about his favorite films, and he doesn't speak like a critic or a collector. He talks about scripts, the rhythm of words, and the way dialogue can inform your body the way music guides a pianist's hands. To Hopkins, cinema is not just performance, it's a conversation between actor and story, a duet between instinct and structure. The 6 films he names as his favorites reveal not only what he admires as an artist, but what he values as a man: empathy, precision, and truth. Some are his own masterpieces. Others are classics that once set his imagination alight. Together, they trace the evolution of a performer who still believes that every day is a rehearsal. Number 6. Nixon, 1995. When Anthony Hopkins played the role of Richard Nixon, even his closest friends questioned why. After all, Nixon wasn't a character audiences loved. He was the scarred face of scandal, paranoia, and political downfall. But that was precisely what drew Hopkins in. He once said in an interview that he felt great empathy for Nixon, a man of immense pride who loved being president and then screwed it up. He described him as a lonely, tragic figure and added that he was surprised Nixon didn't simply blow his brains out after Watergate. To Hopkins, Nixon wasn't a villain. He was Shakespearean. He's like King Lear, he said, a man collapsing under the weight of his own ambition. Hopkins saw in him the perfect study of contradiction, the hunger for greatness shadowed by insecurity and guilt. That empathy became the foundation of his performance. Under Oliver Stone's intense direction, Hopkins didn't try to impersonate Nixon. He tried to understand him. The voice, the hunched posture, the haunted eyes, all were built from compassion, not caricature. Hopkins later recalled that he approached the role as a kind of excavation. You don't play the mask, he said, you play what's behind it. And so he studied tapes of Nixon's late-night speeches, the stumbles and sighs between sentences, the way his hands clenched when he lied to himself. He found humanity in the pauses, the tremors that revealed more than words ever could. When Nixon opened in 1995, a lot of reviewers were agog. Roger Ebert thought Hopkins somehow nailed Nixon's melancholy grandeur. Less impersonation, more incarnation. A man drowning in his own contradictions. The film won Hopkins another Academy Award nomination, but at this stage in his career, awards were beside the point. For him, the real reward was finding that with empathy, even the most despised figure could be turned into something recognizably human. Hopkins has said that great acting, on one level, is an act of forgiveness. You look for the part of them that's you, he said. You find the wound. He did that with Nixon. He took a political headline and made it a psychological portrait. He would not judge. Instead, he dug down to find the loneliness that power masks. It runs through much of his work. This men imprisoned by duty and unable to reveal their hearts until it is too late. There's a quiet moment in Nixon that Hopkins has said he's particularly proud of, when the president sits alone in the Lincoln bedroom, speaking softly to a portrait of John F. Kennedy. I'm not a crook, he mutters. But the words sound more like a plea for mercy than a defense. That was the tone Hopkins brought to the entire film, not outrage, not satire, but sorrow. It's what made the performance unforgettable. Decades later, Hopkins still cites Nixon as one of the most taxing roles of his career. Not for the politics, but for the humanity. He proved that empathy isn't weakness, it's clarity. To see people fully, even at their worst, is an actor's greatest challenge, and perhaps his greatest gift. Number 5. On the Waterfront, 1954. Long before Anthony Hopkins ever stood in front of a camera, he sat in a dark theater in Wales, watching Marlon Brando redefine what acting could be. The film was On the Waterfront, and it didn't just impress him, it converted him. Hopkins would later say that Brando's famous taxicab scene was still breathtaking decades after its release. It was the moment he realized that acting could be alive, spontaneous, truthful, unpolished. "I could have been a contender," Brando says, his voice shaking between anger and regret. Hopkins said that line echoed in his mind for years. It wasn't the words themselves, it was what Brando did between them. The hesitation, the confusion, the quiet heartbreak. Hopkins once admitted that Brando's performance in that scene was the reason he became an actor. "He changed the language of film," he said. "He made it human again." British acting at the time was rooted in theatrical precision. The way one pronounced the words, the posture, the restraint. And then there was Brando, mumbling, sweating, feeling. To a young Hopkins, who often felt out of step with polite British training, this was liberation. On the Waterfront was like the discovery of permission to be raw. It showed him that truth mattered more than polish, that silence could speak louder than a soliloquy. In later interviews, Hopkins frequently returned to that idea, the truth of behavior. He admired Brando's willingness to let a pause, a glance, or a shrug carry emotional weight. Hopkins said Brando didn't act, he existed. You could see his thoughts moving behind his eyes. That observation would become central to Hopkins' own approach, especially in his quieter roles like The Remains of the Day or The Father. On the Waterfront echoed Hopkins, too, in its theme of moral awakening. Terry Malloy's struggle to speak the truth is something Hopkins speaks about a lot, the notion of integrity as rebellion. Hopkins once said that true courage in life and art is simply to tell the truth and take the consequences. That philosophy can be traced back to this movie. Terry risks everything in order to stand up to corruption. He loses his friends, his safety, his future, but gains his soul. Hopkins has gone so far as to describe On the Waterfront as one of the greatest acting lessons ever put on film. Certainly not just Brando, because every supporting performance there is real, from Carl Malden to Eva Marie Saint. He admired the way Elia Kazan, the director, creates tension from minor gestures and close-ups, intimacy instead of spectacle. Hopkins once joked he'd watch Brando butter bread for 2 hours, because that too would seem alive. In a way, On the Waterfront set the emotional template for Hopkins' entire career. The stillness, the restraint, the unspoken emotion all trace back to that cab scene. It taught him that acting isn't about pretending. It's about remembering what it feels like to be human. Number 4. The Bounty, 1984. Every actor has one of those films that slips through the cracks, a project that meant more to them than the audience would ever realize. Anthony Hopkins has called The Bounty one of his personal favorites, not because it won awards or box office glory, but because it tested his discipline and deepened his respect for storytelling itself. In 1984, Hopkins stepped aboard a recreation of the HMS Bounty to play Lieutenant William Bligh, the stern, exacting captain whose authority collapses when his crew, led by Mel Gibson's Fletcher Christian, stages a legendary mutiny. Hopkins later told Far Out magazine that the film nearly took a very different form. Under the late director David Lean, the original script would have stretched to 4 or 5 hours. When Roger Donaldson took over, the screenplay was tightened, and Hopkins said he was relieved. It became, he said, the version I was proud to sail with. Hopkins's Bligh isn't the caricature the audience is prepared for. Past adaptations made the captain out to be a sadist. Hopkins found the man inside the myth, rigid, intelligent, frightened of losing control. He approached Bligh not as a villain, but as a professional undone by pride. The key to command, Hopkins once said, is fear and the fear of being disobeyed. Fear pulses through every scene. His clipped orders, his desperate eyes scanning an endless sea of rebellion, reflect the fragility of power. What Hopkins most valued in The Bounty was its moral ambiguity. No one is entirely right, no one entirely wrong. It's the human condition boiled down to wound, salt, and ego. He admired that Donaldson's version resisted melodrama, allowed the ocean itself to judge its characters. The storms were real, the deck slick with cold water, the ropes biting into hands. Hopkins did much of the grueling work himself, believing that authenticity couldn't be faked. You can't pretend to be cold, he said. You either are or you're not. The role also tapped into one of Hopkins' lifelong fascinations: leadership. He's often spoken about how authority exposes the soul, how power isolates those who wield it. In The Bounty, Bly's obsession with order becomes his undoing, the same flaw that fascinates Hopkins in so many of his characters, from Nixon to Hannibal Lecter. Watching Bly lose his ship but cling to his dignity, Hopkins found a kind of tragic purity. When Bly navigates 3,600 miles in an open boat after the mutiny, surviving impossible odds, Hopkins saw not cruelty, but endurance. He was a survivor, he said. And survival is never pretty. Critics have since called The Bounty one of the most nuanced takes on the legend, a film about duty rather than heroism. Hopkins' performance anchors it, cold yet oddly sympathetic, a man who mistakes control for safety. It's easy to understand why the actor holds on to it. For a craftsman for whom scripts are sacred, The Bounty was actually a reminder that imperfection, the unpredictable sea, human error, can make art feel alive. Number 3. The Father, 2020. When The Father was released in 2020, many critics dubbed it a late-career miracle. For Anthony Hopkins, however, it wasn't a miracle. It was a culmination. Decades of craft, intuition, and observation converged into a single, devastating performance. At 83, he gave the world a portrayal of dementia so raw that even seasoned audiences found themselves lost in his confusion. Hopkins later called the screenplay 99.99% perfect, telling The New Yorker that when writing is that good, the actor doesn't act, he simply listens. The words inform your body, he said, comparing it to playing Chopin. Follow the notes, and the emotion appears on its own. Hopkins approached The Father with the discipline of a musician. Every pause, every stammer, every flicker of realization followed the rhythm of Florian Zeller's dialogue. He didn't study medical symptoms or psychological theory, he studied truth, the quiet terror of not knowing what's real. In interviews, he said he wanted the audience to feel what it's like to lose the map. That empathy drove him deeper than technique ever could. He didn't perform dementia. He invited us inside it. The result is at once intimate and universal. Hopkins, a proud man resisting the erosion of his mind, is neither saint nor victim. He's angry, witty, frightened, manipulative, and deeply human. One moment he's charming his daughter. The next, he's accusing her of betrayal. The walls of his flat shift imperceptibly. The faces around him change. Time folds in on itself. Hopkins plays each disorientation with haunting authenticity. It's all right, and, he says near the end, breaking down like a child, I feel as if I'm losing all my leaves. No music, no tricks, just a man stripped bare before the inevitable. For Hopkins, the film wasn't about aging. It was about surrender. He often says that acting, at its core, is letting go, not controlling. In The Father, he found the perfect vehicle for that philosophy. The character's loss of control became the actor's path to truth. Director Florian Zeller later said that Hopkins would sometimes finish a take and simply sit in silence, eyes wet, as if still half inside the memory he'd just relived. Crew members called those moments the quiet storms. The performance earned Hopkins his second Academy Award nearly 3 decades after The Silence of the Lambs. When his name was announced, he was asleep at home in Wales. The next morning, he recorded a short video, humbly dedicating the award to Chadwick Boseman. That simple gesture summed up the man behind the genius, grateful, private, still in awe of the craft itself. Looking back, Hopkins has called The Father the gift of a lifetime. Not because it brought him recognition, but because it reminded him what art can do, make us feel seen. It's not about memory loss, he said. It's about love. In those final trembling words of the film, when Anthony begs for his mother, the boundary between actor and character disappears. We're no longer watching Sir Anthony Hopkins, we're witnessing humanity itself, unguarded. Number 2. The Remains of the Day, 1993. If The Father was a film about losing control, then The Remains of the Day is about never allowing yourself to have it in the first place. For Anthony Hopkins, James Ivory's quiet 1993 masterpiece represents one of the most delicate performances of his career, and one of the few films he calls 99.99% perfect. He told The New Yorker that a screenplay like this is like Chopin. You just play the notes, and the emotion appears. It's not a film about what's said, but about what's suppressed. Hopkins plays Stevens, a dignified English butler whose life has been spent in service to others. His posture is immaculate, his tone unwavering, his face almost unreadable. Yet behind that mask of professionalism is a man who has traded his heart for a code of manners. The story follows him through years of quiet repression as he fails to confess his love to Miss Kenton, Emma Thompson, and later reflects on what might have been. Hopkins' performance is so restrained that a single breath, a flicker of hesitation, feels like an emotional earthquake. He once said that The Remains of the Day was one of the hardest roles he ever played precisely because it required him to do nothing. Stillness, he explained, is the hardest thing for an actor. You have to let the silence carry you. And it's in those silences, especially in the devastating scene where Stevens and Miss Kenton touch hands only to pull apart, that the entire tragedy of the film lies. Hopkins referred to moments such as those as music in slow motion. Every pause, every look, every unspoken confession becomes a note of heartbreak. In interviews, he compared working with James Ivory to performing chamber music. Everything is precise, measured, and collaborative. There was no improvisation, he said, because none was needed. The script told me everything. You just have to trust it. That trust became the foundation of his performance, a masterclass in emotional minimalism. What makes The Remains of the Day so profound, Hopkins says, is its exploration of regret not as a single mistake, but as a lifetime of small denials. He thought duty was love, Hopkins once said of Stevens. He thought control was strength. But in the end, he realizes he's missed the one thing that mattered. It's a realization Hopkins delivers with heartbreaking restraint, never crying, never begging, just standing in the rain, smiling politely as his soul breaks. Critics hailed it as one of the finest performances ever captured on film. Pauline Kael wrote that Hopkins could make you weep without changing his expression, and indeed he does. You don't see the emotion. You feel it vibrating beneath the surface. That's the Hopkins trademark. Acting so subtle, it feels invisible. Even today, he speaks about the remains of the day with reverence. It's about the silence in life, he said. What we don't say. What we lose because we're afraid to speak. Number 1. The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. When The Silence of the Lambs finally hit screens in 1991, it didn't just redefine the thriller, it redefined Anthony Hopkins. In less than 25 minutes of screen time, he created one of the most iconic characters in film history, Dr. Hannibal Lecter, the brilliant, elegant, and terrifying cannibal whose calm intelligence was more chilling than any act of violence. Hopkins once said in The New Yorker that when he first read the script, he didn't even finish it before calling his agent to say, "This is a wonderful part. I want to play him." He later described the script as 99.99% perfect. It didn't need embellishment or grand theatrics. It only needed trust. The words, he said, inform your body. That's how he found Lecter's stillness, not through menace, but through rhythm. He read the lines slowly, precisely, as though savoring them like a fine meal. The pauses became his punctuation marks. The result was hypnotic, a man whose politeness was more dangerous than his appetite. Hopkins approached the role of Lecter as a study in psychology, not in horror. He once joked, "I have an instinct for narcissists." Instead of playing evil, he played intelligence, a predator who sees through everyone else's masks. His decision to rarely blink, to hold Clarice Starling's gaze just a little too long, turned the simple act of looking into an act of domination. Director Jonathan Demme said the performance worked because Hopkins never overplayed it. He let the audience imagine what he was capable of. The scene in which Lecter first meets Clarice just standing still in that glass cell, voice soft, diction perfect, is by now iconic in pop culture. Hopkins said he studied the way reptiles move, how they conserve energy until the precise moment of attack. Stillness, he explained, is power. And nowhere in cinema is that more evident than in Lecter's soft-spoken cruelty. A line like, "I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti," is delivered not as a threat, but as a confession of pleasure. Behind the horror, though, Hopkins saw humanity, the mirror image of Clarice's courage. He admires her, Hopkins said. He doesn't want to kill her. He wants to understand her. That complexity is what makes Lecter unforgettable. He's not a monster, he's a man whose intellect devoured his empathy. Hopkins' performance won him the Academy Award for Best Actor, and the film swept the Oscars, becoming one of only 3 movies in history to win all 5 major categories. More than 3 decades on, Hopkins still speaks of The Silence of the Lambs with gratitude. "It was a great script," he says simply. "I just followed the notes." In that modest statement lies his whole philosophy of acting. Let the work speak. Don't show the fear. Let the silence carry it. At the age of 88, Sir Anthony Hopkins is living proof that mastery isn't about mystery. It's about consistency, humility, and curiosity. His 6 favorite films reveal the anatomy of that mastery, from the tortured loneliness of Nixon to the cold control of The Silence of the Lambs, from the command and chaos of The Bounty to the emotional surrender of The Father. Each film reflects a portion of his own artistic journey. He values stories that test empathy, scripts that demand precision, and directors who believe in silence over spectacle. Hopkins often says that great acting is learning to listen to the script, to your fellow actors, to the rhythm beneath the words. In every one of these films, whether he's serving tea in the remains of the day or serving terror in the silence of the lambs, he listens. He lets the story move through him, not the other way around. That's what makes him timeless. He has spent a lifetime studying humanity from every angle: its pride, its fear, its hunger for connection. Even now, he still calls himself a student. Every day, he says, is a rehearsal. It's a line that sums up his philosophy: the applause always ends, but the art lives on in curiosity. So, the next time you see one of his films, don't only look at the performance. Watch the patience, the precision, the pauses. Because within those silences lies the truth of Anthony Hopkins, not a legend pretending to be human, but a human who has never stopped seeking the truth in the art of pretending.